South Africa is back in Washington's crosshairs, and this time it's accusing Pretoria of threatening its national security. Just days after South Africa hosted BRICS military drills, Washington's moved to block what it calls a transfer of NATO military technology to China. US authorities have filed a civil case after intercepting advanced training systems linked to a South African school called the Test Flying Academy of South Africa.
The United States did not intercept anything inside China, and that single detail already makes this story feel wrong. The seizure happened in South Africa, far from the country that is supposedly at the center of the threat, and it involved training systems, not weapons, not missiles, not anything that looks like an immediate military danger. Yet the response from Washington was dramatic, public, and framed in the language of national security and counterintelligence, as if a covert operation had been uncovered rather than a shipment of equipment. A civilian flight academy was suddenly described as a strategic threat, and Africa itself appeared to be treated less as a location and more as the problem. The emotional weight of the reaction feels completely out of proportion to what was actually seized, which raises deeper questions that official statements never really address. Why would something passing through Africa trigger more alarm than the same thing arriving directly in China? And what does this say about how Africa is really positioned inside the global power system? Let's find out. The reason Africa became the focal point of this case is that the anxiety was never truly about the machines themselves, but about the role Africa was beginning to play inside the system that moved them. If the technology alone had been the real threat, the interception would have taken place quietly at the point of use, handled as a technical export violation rather than a geopolitical incident. Instead, the drama erupted at the point of transfer, long before the equipment ever reached its final destination. That detail is not accidental. It reveals that what unsettled Washington was not the existence of the simulators, but the fact that an African institution had positioned itself as a meaningful intermediary in a strategic knowledge network. For most of modern history, Africa has existed inside global power structures as a destination rather than a connector. Resources flowed out, aid flowed in, and expertise almost always moved in one direction, from powerful states to African institutions. Knowledge was something Africa imported, not something it circulated. That hierarchy became so normalized that it stopped being visible. Nobody questioned why African actors were expected to receive training but rarely to provide it. Why African airspace hosted foreign bases but rarely produced globally recognized military academies. Or why African professionals were absorbed into Western systems rather than building autonomous ones. What makes this case unsettling is that it quietly breaks that pattern. A South African academy did not simply host external training or operate under foreign supervision. It functioned as a transfer point for expertise rooted in decades of Western military doctrine. That alone shifts Africa from being a consumer of knowledge to being part of its infrastructure. The difference is structural, not symbolic. A consumer depends on systems built elsewhere. An intermediary reshapes how those systems function. Once Africa begins facilitating the movement of high-level expertise, it stops being peripheral to global power and starts becoming embedded within it. This is why the reaction feels disproportionate to the material reality of what was seized. Two simulators do not alter the balance of global military power. They do not give China capabilities it did not already possess. But Africa operating as a neutral bridge between competing power blocks introduces a level of unpredictability that old hierarchies were never designed to accommodate. Intermediaries create spaces where control is distributed rather than centralized, where knowledge flows cannot be easily licensed, monitored, or politically filtered. For systems built on gatekeeping and exclusivity, that kind of decentralization is deeply unsettling. The real discomfort, then, is not about security in the narrow sense. It is about the collapse of a long-standing assumption that Africa exists inside global systems as a field to be managed, not as a node that manages flows itself. The moment Africa begins to mediate between others, it challenges the idea that strategic knowledge must remain geographically and politically contained within a small group of dominant states. It introduces the possibility of a world where expertise circulates through African institutions without external permission, and that possibility alone is enough to trigger defensive reactions. Africa acting as an intermediary is the real source of anxiety, why does that role feel more threatening than Africa acting as a supplier of resources ever did? Africa acting as an intermediary feels more threatening than Africa acting as a supplier, because intermediaries do not just participate in systems, they reorganize them. A supplier exists inside a structure designed by others. It provides inputs but does not influence the logic of the system itself. An intermediary, by contrast, sits at the level where connections are formed, standards are negotiated, and access is granted or denied. It is not simply part of the flow of power, it becomes a point where that flow can be redirected. This distinction is subtle but decisive, and it explains why the global reaction to Africa's new role carries such psychological weight. Historically, Africa's integration into global systems was built around extraction. The continent supplied labor, minerals, agricultural products in strategic territory, but it did not shape how those resources were distributed, valued, or transformed. The architecture of trade, finance, and security was designed elsewhere, and Africa was positioned as a peripheral component within that architecture. This is why Africa's rise as a resource supplier never fundamentally threatened global hierarchies. Even when African countries became important exporters, they remained dependent on external markets, external standards, and external institutions to give those exports meaning. Their power was material, but not structural. Intermediaries operate at a completely different level. They influence how systems evolve, rather than merely feeding into them. When Africa begins functioning as an intermediary in strategic knowledge networks, it starts shaping who learns, who trains, and who gains institutional legitimacy. This creates a form of power that is not visible in trade statistics or military budgets, but is far more durable. It allows African institutions to participate in the design of global ecosystems rather than simply responding to them. That is precisely what unsettles existing power structures, because it erodes the assumption that authority must always originate in a narrow set of countries. This is why the response feels less like enforcement and more like containment. Systems built on hierarchy are comfortable with suppliers because suppliers remain dependent. They are uncomfortable with intermediaries because intermediaries introduce autonomy. An intermediary can choose partners, create new standards, and facilitate interactions that bypass traditional gatekeepers. Once that happens, control becomes distributed rather than centralized, and influence becomes harder to predict or regulate. For a global order accustomed to monopolizing strategic knowledge, the emergence of African intermediaries represents a loss of narrative and institutional dominance. What makes this shift especially disruptive is that it does not announce itself through political confrontation or ideological rebellion. It emerges quietly through professional networks, training partnerships, and institutional credibility. Africa does not need to declare independence from global systems to alter them. It only needs to become indispensable within them. This is a far more effective form of transformation because it cannot be framed easily as opposition or threat. It simply changes how relevance is structured. In this sense, the anxiety surrounding this case is not about what Africa is doing wrong, but about what Africa is doing differently. The old global order knows how to manage extraction, dependency, and compliance. It does not know how to manage African agencies at the level of systems. Once Africa becomes an intermediary, it no longer fits the role of terrain to be governed. It becomes a space where power is negotiated, not imposed. And if intermediaries collapse old hierarchies by reshaping systems from within, why does the reaction to this shift feel emotional and moral rather than legal or strategic? The reaction feels emotional and moral rather than legal or strategic, because what is being challenged is not a specific rule, but an identity that has structured global power for centuries. Legal systems respond to violations. Psychological systems respond to threats to self-image. In this case, the language used by Western officials reveals that the discomfort goes far beyond technical export controls. Words like enabler, covert, and national danger do not describe a routine regulatory problem. They describe a perceived loss of control over meaning, authority, and narrative. This is not how power speaks when it encounters a manageable issue. It is how power speaks when it feels itself being displaced. For a very long time, the global order has been built around an implicit storyline in which Africa occupies a subordinate position. Africa is framed as a place that needs governance, assistance, stabilization, or guidance, but rarely as a place that produces strategic knowledge or institutional authority. This storyline is not always stated openly, but it is deeply embedded in how policies, partnerships, and discourses are structured. Once Africa begins operating as a generator and distributor of high-level expertise, that storyline becomes incoherent. The system is forced to confront a version of Africa that does not fit its inherited categories, and that creates cognitive friction. Cognitive friction produces emotional responses because it destabilizes identity. The global order is not just a set of institutions. It is also a belief system about who leads, who teaches, and who sets standards. When Africa steps into roles historically reserved for dominant powers, it does not merely alter material arrangements, it disrupts symbolic hierarchies. The reaction, therefore, becomes moralized. Instead of asking whether rules were broken, the discourse shifts toward whether Africa should even be allowed to occupy such a position in the first place. This is why the language feels alarmist, rather than analytical. It is attempting to reassert a boundary that has already begun to dissolve. What makes this particularly revealing is that similar activities by other regions do not provoke the same intensity of response. European or Middle Eastern institutions engaging in strategic training partnerships are rarely framed as existential threats. Their actions are interpreted as part of normal global competition. Africa, however, is still interpreted through a lens of exceptionalism, where competence itself becomes suspicious. The underlying assumption is that Africa's participation in strategic domains must be supervised, limited, or explained, rather than taken as a legitimate expression of agency. This is not a legal distinction. It is a psychological one rooted in historical power relations. The emotional tone of the reaction, therefore, reflects a deeper struggle over narrative control. If Africa can produce and circulate strategic knowledge without external authorization, then the idea that global leadership is naturally Western becomes harder to sustain. The system is forced to confront its own contingency, to recognize that its authority is not inherent but constructed. That realization is uncomfortable because it undermines the moral foundations of dominance. Instead of being the neutral arbiter of global order, the West appears as one actor among many, competing for influence in a world that no longer revolves around a single center. This is why the response to this case feels less like enforcement and more like anxiety. It is not driven by immediate security risks, but by the fear that long-standing identities are becoming obsolete. Once Africa is no longer easily classified as dependent, underdeveloped, or peripheral, the global imagination loses a reference point that has organized power for generations. So if the reaction is rooted in psychological and symbolic disruption, rather than material danger, what kind of future is Africa actually moving toward within the global system? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Africa is moving toward a future where power is no longer defined by geography, territory, or even formal political alliances, but by participation in invisible systems that structure how the world actually functions. In the 20th century, power could be mapped. It lived in capitals, military bases, industrial centers, and financial hubs. You could point to it on a globe. You could identify it by borders, flags, and armies. Influence meant physical control over space and resources. Today, that logic is dissolving. Power now lives inside networks that cannot be easily seen or captured. Training pipelines, professional ecosystems, certification regimes, research communities, logistics intelligence, and institutional memory. These systems determine who produces knowledge, who validates it, and who has the authority to transfer it across contexts. This is the layer Africa is quietly entering. Not through dramatic political confrontation, but through functional integration into global infrastructures of expertise. African institutions are increasingly participating in spaces where standards are set, skills are reproduced, and legitimacy is conferred. These are not symbolic roles. they are operational ones. Once a country or region becomes embedded in such systems, it stops being peripheral, even if its GDP or military budget remains modest. Relevance in the modern world is no longer measured primarily by size or wealth, but by how indispensable one is to the functioning of key networks. Africa's growing presence in knowledge-based domains therefore represents a form of power that is subtle, cumulative, and difficult to reverse. What makes this transition especially significant is that it does not rely on ideology or confrontation. Africa does not need to declare itself independent from global structures to reshape them. It only needs to become necessary within them. When African institutions provide training, certification, or strategic expertise that others rely on, they acquire leverage without having to demand it. Dependence begins to flow in both directions. This creates a kind of power that is structurally embedded rather than politically asserted. It cannot be removed by sanctions, because it is not located in a single institution or territory. It is distributed across relationships, practices, and professional communities. This shift also explains why traditional tools of influence feel increasingly inadequate. Diplomatic pressure, aid conditionality, and narrative framing were effective in a world where power was centralized and hierarchical. They are far less effective in a world where power is networked and diffused. Once Africa becomes part of the infrastructure of global knowledge, attempts to control it through external regulation appear increasingly artificial. You can regulate objects, but you cannot easily regulate systems of learning, trust, and institutional reputation. These evolve organically and reproduce themselves through participation. The deeper implication is that Africa's future role in the global system will not be defined by whether it aligns with one bloc or another, but by whether it becomes a site where multiple systems intersect. A place where different doctrines, technologies, and professional cultures meet and interact. This position is strategically powerful precisely because it resists monopolization. It allows Africa to operate as a platform rather than a client, a connector rather than a subordinate. Such a role does not produce immediate headlines or dramatic confrontations, but it reshapes the underlying architecture of global order over time. In this emerging landscape, Africa's significance is no longer derived from what it possesses materially, but from what it enables structurally. It becomes important not because it is large or wealthy, but because it is woven into the processes that generate and circulate expertise. This is a form of power that is difficult to challenge directly, because it does not look like power in the traditional sense. It simply looks like participation. Yet participation at this level transforms the system from within. And if Africa is entering a world where power is embedded in networks rather than territories, how does this change the way the next generation relates to global politics altogether? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The next generation relates to global politics less as a contest of flags and alliances and more as a question of position inside systems that actually shape everyday life. For African Gen Z, power is no longer something that exists primarily in speeches, summits, or ideological blocs. It exists in access to platforms, control over knowledge flows, ownership of institutions, and the ability to move across networks without asking for permission. This generation has grown up watching political loyalty fail to deliver structural change. They have seen how aligning with one global power or another often reproduces dependency rather than autonomy. As a result, their instinct is not to choose sides, but to seek leverage. Leverage in this context does not mean military strength or economic dominance. It means becoming functionally necessary. Gen Z understands that the most durable form of influence is not derived from symbolic alliances, but from being embedded in processes that others rely on. If African institutions become indispensable in training, certification, logistics, or technological ecosystems, then Africa no longer needs to demand respect. It becomes unavoidable. This is a far more powerful position than ideological alignment, because it cannot be withdrawn by diplomatic shifts or political pressure. Once a system depends on you, it must negotiate with you. This perspective also reflects a deeper shift in how Gen Z understands sovereignty. Instead of viewing sovereignty as isolation or self-sufficiency, they see it as the ability to operate across systems without being subordinated within them. Sovereignty becomes a question of mobility rather than separation, of participation rather than withdrawal. African Gen Z is therefore less interested in nationalist rhetoric and more interested in institutional ownership. They want African platforms, African certification bodies, African research centers, and African training institutions that operate globally, not as symbolic gestures of pride, but as functional components of the world economy. What distinguishes this generation from earlier ones is that they are not emotionally invested in replacing Western dominance with Eastern dominance. They do not seek to transfer dependency from one power center to another. Instead, they want to dissolve the very structure of dependency by positioning Africa as a space where multiple systems intersect on relatively equal terms. This is why they are skeptical of narratives that frame Africa's role primarily through external threats or alliances. Such narratives reduce Africa back to a site of contest between others, rather than a participant in shaping the contest itself. Gen Z's response to cases like this one is therefore not outrage in the traditional sense, but recognition. They see it as evidence that Africa is approaching a threshold where its actions generate global reactions, not because it is weak, but because it is becoming relevant in new ways. This relevance is not yet fully visible in economic indicators or political rankings, but it is visible in the growing attention paid to African institutions by global actors. Attention is the first sign of structural importance. You do not monitor what does not matter. For this generation, the goal is not to be praised or protected by global powers, but to be integrated into the layers of the system that cannot function without African participation. Once that happens, Africa's position changes from being negotiated externally to being assumed internally. The continent stops being something that global politics happens to and starts being something that global politics happens through. If Gen Z is focused on becoming structurally indispensable rather than politically aligned, what kind of ending does this shift create for Africa's role in the world? The shift Gen Z is creating leads to an ending that is not dramatic in the way old political stories used to be, but far more profound in its long-term consequences. Africa's role in the world is no longer moving toward a single moment of recognition, a symbolic victory, or a formal seat at some global table. It is moving towards something quieter and more irreversible: structural presence. Africa is becoming embedded in the systems that produce, validate, and circulate power itself. Not as a guest, not as a beneficiary, but as a functional component of how those systems operate. Once that happens, Africa's relevance stops being a matter of opinion or ideology and becomes a matter of necessity. This is what makes the future fundamentally different from every previous phase of African global integration. In the past, Africa's position depended on how others perceived it, whether it was seen as poor, unstable, developing, strategic, or emerging shaped how it was treated. Now, perception is becoming secondary to function. When African institutions are involved in training networks, professional ecosystems, research pipelines, and knowledge infrastructures that others rely on, Africa no longer needs to argue for its importance. It simply becomes part of the machinery that keeps the global system running. You do not debate the relevance of a component you cannot remove without breaking the system itself. The most powerful aspect of this transformation is that it cannot be easily reversed. Sanctions can isolate states, narratives can delegitimize governments, but systems reproduce themselves through participation. Once Africa is woven into global networks of expertise, those networks generate their own momentum. They create relationships, dependencies, standards, and expectations that persist regardless of political shifts. This means Africa's new position is not held by force, but by function. It exists not because someone granted it, but because removing it would be too costly for everyone involved. This also changes the emotional texture of global politics. Africa no longer has to perform weakness to receive attention, nor strength to demand respect. Its influence emerges from usefulness rather than symbolism. The world begins to interact with Africa less as a project to be managed and more as a system to be coordinated with. That transition is subtle, but it reshapes everything from diplomacy to economic strategy. Negotiation replaces supervision. Collaboration replaces conditionality. Presence replaces permission. What makes this ending uncomfortable for the old order is that it does not follow the familiar script of rise and challenge. There is no single confrontation, no ideological showdown, no dramatic overthrow of existing powers. Instead, there is a slow reconfiguration of relevance. Africa does not defeat anyone. It outgrows the roles that kept it marginal. It becomes too integrated to ignore, too connected to exclude, and too functional to dismiss. This kind of transformation is difficult to resist because it does not announce itself as opposition. It simply changes how the world works. In this future, Africa's power is not measured by how loudly it speaks or how aggressively it asserts itself, but by how deeply it is embedded in the systems that shape global outcomes. The continent becomes a space where knowledge flows, standards are negotiated, and expertise is generated in ways that others depend on. That dependence is the real source of influence. Not control over territory, not dominance over markets, but indispensability within networks. The ending, then, is not about Africa finally being accepted. It is about Africa becoming unavoidable. And once a system becomes unavoidable, it stops needing validation from anyone outside it. It simply exists as part of the structure of reality itself. The real question now is not whether Africa will be included in the future, but whether the global order is prepared for a future that quietly reorganizes itself around Africa's presence rather than its absence. Let us know in the comment section, can the US do anything about it? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.